Gerda Weisman was a Nazi concentration camp survivor. And recently, she gave a telephone interview. And during that interview, she talked a little bit about her experience in this concentration camp. She was in a camp with other women, and she told the person who was interviewing her about an experience that they had where they were all called to roll call one day out in an outer assembly area. She said, we stood hours upon hours at attention in this assembly area. No one said why we were there, but we just were there and we were made to stand. And she said some of the women just eventually collapsed because of the fatigue of just standing there. Gerda said that as she was standing there, she noticed off to the side of the assembly area there was a crack in the pavement. And in the crack in the pavement, she saw a little flower growing up. She said she focused on that little flower. And other women also saw the flower, and they focused on that little flower growing from the crack in the pavement. And she said that flower, and her focusing upon it, kept her going. Gave her strength. She said, it was amazing. That little flower brought to me hope. And not only to me, but to the other women that were with me. She said, because after the assembly was over, we were allowed to return to our barracks, from that day on, you'd see thousands of feet shuffle just to avoid stepping on that little flower in the assembly area. Now, why would they avoid stepping on a flower? Well, as Gerda said, that flower was a symbol of hope. It was a symbol of new life in the midst of their darkness and despair. Now, like Gerda, the prophet Isaiah also saw a symbol of hope one day. The year was 700 BC. For 40 years, the people of Israel had been fighting the Assyrians and sometimes the Egyptians, who just terrorized their whole country. For 40 years, the Hebrew people were fighting day in and day out. And the Hebrew people were losing their will to fight, their will to just exist. It was a time of great darkness, a time of great despair. Actually, historians today refer to that 40-year period as the first Holocaust of the Jews. Jewish historian Bill South would write these words about that 40-year period of time. 5 times during these 40 years did the Assyrian army, the vast and superior Assyrian army, stamping through the hill country of Israel, working terror and destruction wherever it went, with no regard for anyone's culture, with no regard for anyone's religion, with no regard for anyone else's life. The Assyrians came like a scorpion plague, devouring everything and everyone in their path. Over and over and over, the people of Israel were ravaged. The horrid sounds of war were ever familiar. The cries of pain seldom ceased. Who could plant a field and have any hope that it would survive to the harvest? Who could bear a child with confidence that their baby would ever reach maturity? It was a horrible 40 years for those Hebrew people. Isaiah lived during that time period. It was a dark, dark period of time. But one day Isaiah saw something that brought to him hope. He didn't see a little flower growing off in a crack of pavement, but Isaiah saw a stump. Actually, it wasn't the stump that brought him hope. What brought him hope was a green shoot that had been growing up out of the stump. as Isaiah gazed upon that green shoot growing from that rotting stump, he would write the words that I read for you earlier. Again, let me just read the first verse. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the branch, and the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and of power. Isaiah saw a coming period of time where, like a shoot, there would come a ruler who would usher in a time of great peace, a time of great tranquility for the human people. He saw this time where adversaries would become friends, where all would live with justice, and there would be equity for everyone. That was the time period that Isaiah saw through the image of that green sheep. Unfortunately, Isaiah would never see that image ever come to fruition. For the Hebrew people, there would still be darkness and despair and injustice year after year after year. And in a sense, we can say that the world still is waiting for that image of Isaiah to come to pass. I mean, when we look at our world today, we do see darkness sometimes. We do see injustice. When we look at our world today, we do see a lot of hurt and pain. And we see tragedy always around the corner. We talked about the family that lost 4 on a car accident. This is the kind of world that we live in, where sometimes darkness crowds out the light. And I need to confess to you, I tend to be a pretty optimistic person, but when I look at our country, when I look at our world, sometimes it's pretty hard for me to see hope for our country and hope for our world. But just when I'm about ready to throw in the towel on hope, all of a sudden something happens. And that kindle of hope is sparked once again into a flame for me. And in a real sense, that's what Christmas can do for us. Christmas can be our sign of hope. It can be that symbol, that green shoot that Isaiah saw. For you see, Christmas, at least for me, reminds me that God is still very much alive.
Amen. Amen.
Even though there is darkness, and even though there is sadness, and even though sometimes that darkness and sadness seems to push aside all the light, knowing that God is still alive, still active, brings hope. Amen?
Amen.
Well, you can try as you might to find hope in the securing of our borders. You can try hard to find hope in entitlement programs. You can try and find hope in electing one political party over another. But in the end, all those human efforts always fall short. And it's only God that just continues to march on. And it's only in God that we find hope. One day, a father and son were looking at the remains of their house. The house had been destroyed in a tornado. And the little boy was crying, and so was the father. And as the father was holding his little boy's hand, he looked down at the little boy and he said, "Son, don't worry, we're going to make it. We're going to make it because God is not dead." And that's what Christmas is about. Christmas reminds us that God is not dead. And even though the world might look dark, even though tragedy might seem like it has the upper hand, God is not dead, and so there is hope. Carl Sandburg, the great writer, once said, "A baby is God's announcement to the world that life will continue on." And so Christmas baby is God's announcement to the world that life will continue on. In his wonderful book, Touch of Wonder, the author tells a story about a man who jumped out of an airplane. He was a parachutist. His main chute failed to open fully, and so he released his auxiliary chute, and that auxiliary chute just wrapped itself around the main chute, further preventing the main chute from opening up, fully deploying. Well, the man hit the ground, they estimated at over 60 miles an hour, and he survived. As he laid in the hospital, the doctors told him that he had so many breaks and fractures throughout his body that he probably would be confined to a wheelchair the rest of his life. And of course, the man was in shock with that news. And despair quickly settled in. But there was another patient in that hospital who was in a wheelchair. His spine had been severed in a car accident. And this patient decided to start visiting the man who probably was going to end up in a wheelchair. And so every day they visited. And the man in the wheelchair was positive and upbeat. And one day the man in the bed looked at the man in the wheelchair and said, "How can you be so positive when you're confined to a wheelchair?" And the man in the wheelchair said, "I wish I could get out of this wheelchair, but it's not going to happen. But yet, there is still so much that I can do." The author then writes these powerful words about that phrase, "but yet." Those two words shift the focus from what has been lost to what remains, and to what may still be gained. God's sending Jesus into the world is his "but yet." It's God's way of saying, even though there appears that a lot has been lost, there still remains a lot. And you never know what's coming in the future. The Christmas babe is God's "but yet." It's God's way of bringing hope to those of us who live in this world. To those of us who sometimes struggle with the darkness. To those of us who sometimes wonder if God is ever listening. To those of us who sometimes become so dismayed with the injustice that we see. Christmas is God's way of saying, "but yet." But yet. Making the internet, there is a poem that kind of speaks a little bit about this. I'm sure some of you have seen it. It's a poem that goes, "Do you still have hope?" I'm going to shorten it just a little bit, but I want to read this and conclude with this. If you could look at the sunset and smile, then you still have hope. If you can find beauty in the colors of a small flower, if you can find pleasure in the movement of a butterfly, if the smile of a child can still warm your heart, then you still have hope. If you can see the good in other people, if the rain breaking on the rooftop can still lull you to sleep, if the sight of a rainbow still makes you stop and stare in wonder,